Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone, or good evening, or good morning, depending on where you're tuning in from. And thank you for joining our UNB Talks webinar, Let Go of the Imposter Syndrome and Perfectionism. We're excited to kick off our fall and winter schedule of virtual events with this topic. It seems to be a very popular and resonates with a lot of people, given the number of registrants we've had today. My name is Mary Duffley, and I'm the Assistant Director of the Associate Alumni. We are very proud of the many opportunities we've been able to offer you, our alumni, over the last year, 18 months or so, from professional development to special interest webinars. We've been really grateful to connect virtually with so many of our alumni, hundreds, if not thousands of alumni from around the world. Today, we've got alumni from obviously Canada, the United States, Iran, India, Ireland, and Trinidad and Tobago, which is incredible. We certainly do hope to hold some in-person gatherings sometime soon, but we certainly plan to continue these virtual offerings like today's webinar going forward. Before I introduce Tanya, just a few housekeeping items. We certainly received a lot of submitted questions when you registered, and we'll certainly try to get to some of those over the course of our hour together. Tanya may very well respond to some of those questions in her presentation as well. You're welcome to ask some questions in the Q&A function below. And if you wish to have some comments, Tanya likes to be engaged with her audience, even though she can't see you. If you have some comments or things to share, you can certainly use the chat function as well. Imposter syndrome is an internal experience of believing that you are not as competent as others perceive you to be. And perhaps this resonates, there's more prevalent this time because of the pandemic that we've been experiencing over the last 18 months. And changes in our workplace and perhaps changes in our personal lives. To help us overcome this feeling of I don't belong here, I'm really pleased to introduce UNB alumna Tanya Chapman. Tanya and I go way back to when we first started our careers when we were just 20-something-year-old. Oh my God, we didn't know anything. I was recruiting for an institution. She was recruiting for another institution. And I've watched her career flourish. She worked in the oil and gas industry for many years in human resources, and then opened this boutique consulting company, the Chapman Group, a few years ago. She's an insightful and inspiring facilitator, so I'm really pleased that she was able to join us today to help us explain this whole psychological phenomenon of the imposter syndrome. So I will turn it over to Tanya.
Thanks very much, Mary. Really excited to be here with everybody today. I am going to share my screen because as we're thinking about imposter syndrome, I think it's really important to understand some of the techniques that we can use individually and with our teams to help people overcome what we've come to know as imposter syndrome. As we're going through the process, as Mary mentioned, please feel free to send a question or respond within the chat function so that we have a really engaging session. Really happy to answer any questions as we go through, but also at the end, should you want to stay around for a little bit. Mary already introduced me. I will tell you I am supported by an amazing team of 7 women at this point who are very focused on helping organizations throughout Atlantic Canada really transform to perform. And we're also affiliated proudly with LMI Canada. LMI is an international executive leadership program organization that helps individuals, teams, and companies achieve their goals. So we're really excited to be a part of LMI as well. Let's get right into imposter syndrome. The agenda that we're going to cover off within the next hour. The first area is really, what is imposter syndrome? What is it? How do we define it? What does it feel like? A lot of people don't put a name to it, but a lot of people describe it to us in our leadership programming. I would say 95% of the people that we work with, regardless of level, regardless of age, regardless of background or experience, would describe feelings of being an imposter. And maybe they don't name it the imposter syndrome, but it certainly is related to some of those feelings of inadequacy. So we're going to talk about that. The second thing we're going to talk about is how imposter syndrome is connected to perfectionism. And I think that's a really important discussion because perfectionism is something that we all sometimes struggle with, and it's very much connected to those feelings of inadequacy. The third area on our agenda will be, how do we actually combat imposter syndrome? What can we do to help mitigate our response to feeling like an imposter? And then finally, we're going to talk about an action plan for personal change and transformation that maybe you can put in place as we're thinking about our own journey, our own leadership capability, and our own leadership journey. That's our roadmap for today's session. And if we don't cover off something that you'd like to cover off, I'm always more than happy to be a phone a friend for fellow alumni. So happy to do that as well. This question, who do you think you are? This is the question that really grates when we think about that imposter syndrome mindset. This is the question that we ponder. So it's a bit of a mind trap when you think about this. Who do you think you are? It really mirrors the requirement to be humble and have that humility. And it creates the dilemma between humility and being humble, along with accomplishment, experience, and education. So it doesn't matter how educated you are, how accomplished you feel. It doesn't matter in terms of your background and all of the accolades you may have achieved over your career. This whole notion around who do you think you are sometimes irritates us to a point where we become fearful, we avoid taking risks, we might have a lot of self-doubt. And in fact, at an extreme level, it can actually create anxiety and depression because we feel perhaps less than what our role or what society thinks that we should be living up to, when in fact, a lot of times the accomplishments are really there. It's a mindset shift that we have to make. So this question, who do you think you are? The next time you ask it of yourself, you need to take a little pause and maybe think about all of the things that you've accomplished. So we're going to talk a little bit more about those strategies. So if we think about imposter syndrome, I'm just going to take a second here and close my blind because I now can't see my screen. So we'll do that. Hopefully that'll help you see me as well. So the question becomes then, what really is imposter syndrome? And it's been defined in a number of ways. The first, Gil Corkindale talks about imposter syndrome as a collection of feelings of inadequacy that persist despite evident success. So again, it's not about the level of success, it's about the feeling of not being successful. The second definition around imposter syndrome is that it's the idea that you've only succeeded due to luck and not because of your talents or qualifications. The sense that, oh, the gatekeeper missed me and I've squeaked through somehow, and now I'm not really up for the job, when in fact your qualifications speak highly of your talent. It's actually why a lot of women in particular, but men too, don't apply to jobs when they're 85% or more qualified. We think, oh, we're not worthy of that job. And then the third definition is that it represents a conflict between your own self-perception and the way that others perceive you. So really thinking about the perception externally versus your internal perception. So that's a third definition of imposter syndrome. What I'd like to do right now, I have a little poll ready for you. I'd like you to tell us anonymously, how often do you feel like an imposter? I'm going to just launch this right now and have you think about that. How often do you feel like an imposter? So we certainly have varying degrees of response, but almost everybody, well, everybody who has answered this poll feels like an imposter at some point. So whether it's once in a while or once a month, or once a week, or maybe even every day at the extreme, we all have that sense of feeling like an imposter. That's the most important thing to remember, is that you are not alone in feeling like an imposter. I was sharing with the group earlier as we started to gather to have our session today. This morning, as I was getting ready, I was thinking to myself, imposter syndrome. That's an interesting topic. I wonder why they asked me to do that. There must be other people who could have spoken about imposter syndrome. So I had this epiphany as I was getting ready this morning that I am actually feeling imposter syndrome over talking about imposter syndrome. So if you think about that, that's a really common occurrence for us, and it's a mental loop that we can get into that we actually have to intentionally break. So let's talk about the basics. An estimated 70% of professionals experience feelings of being an imposter. We also know that it's been around for a long time. It was first described in 1978 by Georgia State University psychologists. Originally, imposter syndrome was attributed to marginalized populations, but now it's understood to be far more expansive, that it touches all generations, it touches all cultures, all backgrounds, all genders. And it was originally believed and actually to be an individual mindset issue, but it's also related to our environment, the environment in which we grow up, to social construct, and also business context. So if you think about that imposter syndrome, it's not just about the individual, it's also about some of the environmental factors or the social factors that we grow up within. We also know that imposter syndrome impacts our overall well-being, and it can create stress and anxiety at extreme levels. But I think a really important point here is that it does impact career progression because it prevents us from perhaps higher order organizational jobs. It prevents us from leadership roles. It prevents us from taking that entrepreneurial risk. And sometimes it actually prevents innovation. So the important part here is to, yes, feel it, but do it anyway, if you think about imposter syndrome. I love this quote. And, you know, we often think about Albert Einstein as someone who had it all together in so many different ways, but there is evidence that Albert Einstein felt like an imposter. The exaggerated esteem in which my life work is held makes me very ill at ease. I feel compelled to think of myself as an involuntary swindler. If you think about Albert Einstein, he does represent what we call imposter syndrome when it comes to expertise, and we're going to come back to that in a couple of minutes. But it's not uncommon, and it's not uncommon for wildly successful people. Sheryl Sandberg, Michelle Obama have all expressed issues around feeling like an imposter. The big piece about imposter syndrome is that it is what we call mental conditioning, because mental conditioning affects the way we act. If we're conditioned to think in a certain way, we will act in a certain way. And we have to intentionally break the cycle of thinking about ourselves as imposters. And I go to this slide thinking about really those boundaries that don't really exist, that we create in ourselves. This is an example. If you think about a baby elephant, thankfully we don't have circuses anymore, but if you think about a baby elephant who is chained to a picket line and can only go in a short circumference around the picket line, as they get older, they could break that chain and move away from the picket line, but they continue to circle the same picket. That's conditioning. So even though we create these habits, and most of our habits are good habits, it gets us to where we are, there are certain habits of thought or habits of behavior that will hold us back. Unless we intentionally break the chain, unless we intentionally reconstruct how we think about ourselves and our accomplishments and our successes, we are unable to move forward. So that's the damaging part of imposter syndrome. What I'd like you to do now is to look at another poll. And let me just see, I'll bring up the, oh, I only see one poll, just 1 second. Let me go to the next poll. I want you to think about successes and failures, and I want you to answer this question. Do you feel like you must not fail? Like a fake sometimes, like living someone else's life? Like every success you've had is due to luck? Or even when you are successful, you can't give yourself the point or the position. You don't give yourself the promotion. So I'm just going to ask you to answer this question around the feelings around imposter syndrome. Just another couple of minutes. Okay, I'm going to end the poll now. And here are your results. So 71% of people identified feeling like you must not fail. Or like a fake, 13%. Like every success you've had is due to luck, 15%. Or 53% of you said, even when you are successful, you can't give yourself a break or a point. You can't give yourself the promotion. Very common. Very first action that you have to identify here is to recognize that you're not alone, as we talked about, but secondly, that your feelings are valid and that we have to address the feelings themselves. So taking a second and actually writing out how you feel is a really important technique that I am just really learning myself as I'm getting older. There are different types of imposters, though. Dr. Valerie Young has identified 5 different types of imposters. And as I read these out and as you think about them, I'd really like you to think about which imposter you are demonstrating most of the time. The first one, the perfectionist. The perfectionist sets excessively high goals to achieve. Failure is not an option. They have their most of their self-doubt or their worries about not being able to measure up. So they defer to the perfect. Whether they realize it or not, they can be control freaks. They can be very difficult micromanagers. They also have difficulty delegating, and it's all about 100% perfect 100% of the time. That's the perfectionist. The second behavior that we see around an imposter syndrome type is the superhero. So this superhero, they experience the sense that they're phonies and they're really working against real deal colleagues and they have to live up. So they push themselves to work harder and measure up to a great deal of success. And they are often defined by workaholic types of behaviors, not being able to take any downtime. Maybe their hobbies and their passions falter because they are so focused on work. That's number 2. Number 3 is what we call the natural genius. So the natural genius is someone who really believes that the ability to easily pick stuff up in a fast way is as an indicator of how successful they are. So the natural genius, they judge their competence by ease and speed as opposed to their efforts. So how easily they're able to master a certain topic. They too set impossibly high bars for themselves and for others. They don't just judge themselves based on these expectations. They also judge themselves based on getting things right on the first go. So the natural genius puts a lot of pressure on themselves. Often they're the straight A students, the gold star, really, that sort of defined by how fast they move and how fast they are able to pick up work. The fourth is the soloist. The soloist is almost like the savior. They refuse to be assisted. They don't ask for help. They don't want to be found out, so they just work as hard as they can by themselves to prove their worth. The soloist will often not seek out expertise. They'll just really plow through it to get it done. And then finally, the expert. What and how much they know is really critical. So they are always defining themselves by their ability to speak to really broad and deep topics. They want to be knowledgeable. They fear being inexperienced or looking like that they lack knowledge. You know, they might shy away from job postings. They might question their role in the organization because they're always seeking out that expertise. So those are the 5 different types. If you were to define one of those types that really speak to you, which one do you think more readily describes you as an imposter type? So let me just launch this poll.
Tanya, somebody just asked whether you can be a combination of these. Do you have to be one or the other, or can you be a combination?
Oh, I think you can be a combination. For sure. You might have one preference, but you can definitely be a combination. Wow, we have a lot of perfectionists in this crowd. So here are your results. So perfectionists, 38% of you said perfectionism was your defined imposter type. Superhero was next, followed by the soloist, the natural genius, and the expert. So a lot of similar scores there. It is important to define, I think, your imposter syndrome type so that you can start to address it. Because remember, when you think about that mental conditioning, imposter syndrome is really a fallacy. It's a lie that you tell yourself. So if you can define your type or your style, then you can begin to address it. Number one thing to do to combat imposter syndrome is to create your own definition of success. So own your own definition of success. First thing, interrogate reality. When you have this mental sentence going on in your head, you're not good enough, you're not good enough, you're not good enough. Interrogate that. Why am I good enough? So alternate the way you think. The second point is that no one can be authentic by trying to be like someone else. I always advise that you take a minute and write down what is your own definition of success. What does success look like for you? Not what society thinks it should be, or what your parents think it should be, or what your partner thinks it should be, but what is your own personal definition of success? You need to have a well-established sense of yourself. And also act like the kind of person that you think you are. You know, be authentic. And the other part of this is building a self-image that's equal to the importance of the role you play. So if you are in a senior role in an organization, or you're running an organization, or maybe you have a startup, think about the role that you are playing, and then figure out the match. Here's the role, and here's how I match it. Avoid the negative self-talk. The other important piece to this is knowing your own values and your own personal mission. If you have not done a values exercise, I always recommend that you do this. So get a list of values that you can find on the internet or wherever it is, and just take a minute and think about what are your top 5 values. And then what's your deal breaker? More importantly, though, how are you living your values? If you think about the job or the role, it's more about, am I living my values, rather than the measurement of success that is somebody else's measurement of you. So number one, get clear about your own definition of success. And the second, figure out your values and your deal breaker so that you reposition how you think about your work from here are the job responsibilities to here's how I'm living my values. Another really important point is to focus on purpose and passion. When we think about being authentic, if we're truly authentic, the perfectionism goes away a bit. Because if we have a well-articulated vision for ourselves and a personal mission, when we're demonstrating authentic leadership, we're not measuring against something else. We're just doing that from our own internal attitude motivation. The other piece that I love, I always think about this inner critic. Get rid of your inner critic. Name her or him or it. And every time she shows up, be prepared to change your thought pattern. My inner critic tells me I'm not good enough. Oh, you're not good enough for that. And then I have to be prepared to say, oh, yes, I am. And here's why. Think about those items in advance so that when your inner critic shows up and she's on your shoulder, you can push her right off because you are able to respond in a way that's intentional and already thought through. Again, these are habits of thought. So interrupt the habit of thought created by your inner critic. And then the last point here is, what are your unique contributions and gifts? So rather than thinking about your gaps, what are your unique contributions and gifts that you're providing the world and providing your role or providing your company, providing your family, your community? And we twist our thinking from success criteria that's on a scorecard to contributions and gifts. And the performance comes later. Mary, I'm going to pause. Are there any questions so far that we haven't yet addressed?
I have lots of questions that were submitted. There's nothing in the Q&A right now,
Okay.
but I'll ask a question because we talked a little bit about it. How do you balance? There was somebody that talked about, obviously, the imposter syndrome is something everyone experiences. We're looking now that there's a lot of people who are experiencing this. How do you balance, though, about being overconfident with the imposter syndrome? Like, I mean, there's people who exude this overconfidence and sometimes almost to a fault. Is there a fine line too?
Yeah, for sure. I think there definitely is a fine line. If you think about the difference between confidence and cocky, somebody who walks in and is confident, they don't have to actually talk about all of their accolades and their degrees and their successes. They demonstrate that by their conversation and their questions of others. So the ability to demonstrate confidence versus that cockiness is something I always call executive presence and voice power. It's showing up, being present in the moment, and making the other person feel like they're the only person in the room, rather than having to defend and provide data and information because you're not feeling like you're able to maybe match up or measure up to others. So there is a real art to it, and there's a balance to it. And a couple of very quick things: ask great questions, get curious, lead with your heart, not your head. Those are some of those areas where confidence will be demonstrated over and above that cockiness. Great question.
Question that was just submitted, and I think I know the answer. Why is it bad to have an imposter syndrome? Doesn't it motivate you to be excellent at what you're doing? So sometimes having an imposter syndrome really does push you to do more or do better. Is that true?
Well, I think that's a great question. When you think about imposter syndrome, it's really kind of the extreme, though. If you are someone who reflects deeply, deep reflection and understanding your strengths, knowing that your weaknesses are really often those overused strengths. So if you think about weaknesses, they're often when you overuse a strength. But the reflection is important, and then the course correction based on the reflection is important. And a good leader does that, If you think about level 5 leadership, talks about when things go wrong, looking in the mirror, and when they go right, looking out the window at others. So self-reflection is important. When you think about the difference between that and imposter syndrome, that's when it becomes debilitating. Yeah, great question. Let's talk a little bit about that. The difference too is there's a difference between perfection and excellence. If you are really feeling that imposter syndrome and you're aiming for perfection, there is no such thing as perfect. I certainly haven't experienced it, but there is such a thing as striving for excellence. And that's how we have to reposition our thinking between understanding our gaps and really working on those and leveraging our strengths. That's excellence. Perfection, though, is when you focus on the gap. And the reasons why people then opt out is that maybe their goals are not personal, that maybe they're not worth it, that the goal isn't planned out, that it's not chopped into smaller blocks and that we can feel successful about over time. And then sometimes we have to turn that adversity around, difficulties at work or difficulties at home or fighting for causes within our community by maintaining that tough mental attitude and exercising patience toward a goal and the ability to determine our own priorities. So this sort of fake view of what perfect looks like in a job or in a leadership role or in a community or in a family, that's not reality. So rather than measuring ourselves against that perfect perspective of success, we define our own success and then create goals that will progressively get us toward that definition of success. Perfection is a fallacy. Excellence, you can work toward excellence every single day. And then again, it goes back to that setting progressive goals that are worthwhile and predetermined. So this is an example, big work goal that you might get really scared about. Deliver the company budget on time by engaging all leaders in the process. That's a huge goal, especially if you're working in a big company. Part of the ability to move from excellence to perfectionism is breaking down the goal. All right, first step is going to be to deliver a 30-minute presentation on the importance of budgeting to a leadership team. Well, how am I going to do that? Well, I'm going to read 3 articles on presentation skills. I'm going to seek out a coach, and I'm going to practice 3 times before the session. And then I think about, well, how am I actually going to what resources am I going to need? I'm going to need articles and a coach. Here are my target dates, and here's what success looks like. Rather than thinking about this great, big, huge, lofty goal that seems scary, it's about that progressive goal that is related to those worthwhile and predetermined big goals. That helps with our perfectionism mindset, and it allows us to experience successes along the way rather than thinking about the overall big, scary goal. So that's another technique and tactic to use. Any other questions, Mary, from coming in?
Yeah, we'll wait till the end and we'll hit some of these questions that we've had submitted to. I'm sure some people will have some other ones as well when we finish.
Awesome. Good. All right, so a big part of this is also just drawing on your expertise and helping yourself understand that your belief system can be faulty. First thing, act with positive expectancy. I don't know if you are familiar with that term, but what it really means is that if you believe you can, you more than likely can. If you believe you can't, then you more than likely can't. So positive expectancy is the personal belief that you are able to do something and that you are equipped, that you are able to move through adversity. There is a quote that says, if you believe you can or you can't, you're right. So the belief is that, again, that mental model that says, I am capable to learn something new. I am capable to conduct this survey. I'm capable to do this job. So mindset shift. The next one, belief, affirmation, and visualization. So belief in yourself is helped by having these affirmative words or sentences that can help you. You know, again, when I was talking about this morning, thinking about imposter syndrome, my affirmation was, of course I can do this. I have done it before, I can do it again. Those are the kinds of affirmations that you can say to yourself. And visualizing, you know, sometimes you can really visualize something by having an item on your desk or a poster. Some people do vision boards. It can also be just as simple as, you know, writing down some words around what it's going to look like for you in 5 years. But focusing on the visualization helps us get over the fear. Attitudes and habits of belief, we've already talked about that. Another technique that I love, and I've done it since I was probably 20 years old, is to keep an evidence-based portfolio, a career portfolio, where you stick in that portfolio, whether it's virtual or an actual artist type of portfolio, evidence of what you've accomplished, what you've done, you know, great projects you've worked on, creative writing that you've done, whatever it might be. And so you almost create this evidence-based portfolio for yourself. It's also really great when you are looking to advance in your career. Keep your resume updated with your accomplishments. Again, it's about your mindset, thinking about what you've done and what you've accomplished. I also love when we're coaching clients to talk to them about creating a mind map where you can map out your talents and expertise. You can actually, instead of doing a resume, just make it into pictures, put you in the middle with all of the things that you've built and developed and created or have become over the last number of years. And then finally, a lessons learned mindset. If you do fail, think about what were the lessons learned here and how do I take those lessons forward into my next career or into my next job. So draw on your own expertise and refer to it often. This is an important lesson, I think, and it starts when you are in your teens and beyond, but find your own advisory committee. And what I mean by that is find a coach, build mentoring relationships, ask for feedback, because often the feedback that we get from people, it's a gift. So whether it's constructive or it's positive, we can build that into our thinking. Always question an alternative interpretation of events. Oh, I don't think I'm good enough for this. Well, actually, what if I thought that I was good enough for this? What would be the evidence? And then again, our habits of thought need to be checked at the door, and our advisory committees can help with this. So create an army of support around you that can help you question your own viewpoint around being an imposter. I also wanted to talk about employers. So I talked a little bit about the fact that the imposter syndrome was originally thought of as an individual type of mindset. But in reality, what we know to be true is that there are social constructs and cultural constructs and business constructs that help sometimes play into others feeling like imposters. So as an employer, I would be remiss if I didn't stop for a second and talk about what employers can do to level the playing field so that imposter syndrome is mitigated and it's you know, as low as possible in your organization. And the first one is focus on diversity and inclusion. Challenge the system. You know, there are certain systems in business that are paternalistic and are hierarchical that don't need to be so at this point in our evolutionary mandate throughout history. So challenge the system if you are in a position to do so. Hire for passion and purpose and train for skill and capability. I will hire somebody with a leadership heart every time. Provide employees with support through mentorship and coaching. Train and develop regularly so people feel capable. Compensation equity. A big part of this is making sure our compensation is kept in an equitable way. Be transparent about why you promote. And then finally, encourage risk-taking and innovation and learning from failure as part of the culture. So as employers, we have a responsibility to ensure that imposter syndrome is reduced, that our teams are feeling engaged and they're living up to fully who they want to be, and at the same time supporting our organizational goals and our results. So finally, your plan of action. Number one, think about your imposter style and start fighting against it. Write down your own definition of success. What does it look like? Develop a mission statement and consider your career in this context, not about a job, but about fulfilling a personal mission. Describe your values and how you live them. Boot your inner critic to the curb. Interrogate reality, and make sure you're replacing her with positive thoughts. Keep track of your progress. Find yourself an advisory committee. And then if you're in a position to do so, change the system for other people. So finally, I have my own quote that I think of when I feel like I'm an imposter. And it's a Marianne Williamson quote, and it sounds like this: our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. It is our light, not our darkness, that most frightens us. We ask ourselves, who am I to be brilliant, gorgeous, talented, fabulous? Actually, who are you not to be? And then probably the most important part of that is your playing small does not serve the world. So that's the quote that I will say to myself when I get into that imposter syndrome mindset. Mine is, your playing small does not serve the world. So that's all I wanted to share with you this afternoon, but I will pause there, and Mary will go over maybe the questions.
Thank you, Tanya. That was awesome. I mean, incredible. I think I should have listened to this. You should have been presenting to me back when I was in my 30s and 40s. I would have done so much better, I think. Is the syndrome connected to, correlated to an individual's personality type? And second part, has the pandemic been responsible to a certain extent for this syndrome, or the worsening of this syndrome for some folks?
Yeah, well, I think all personality types that I am aware of experience this syndrome. It's not correlated with any particular style. We use lots of different personality style instruments, whether it's Insights or our LMI assessment tools, Myers-Briggs. It doesn't seem to be correlated with personality type. It seems to be correlated with, again, that sort of background, social context, those feelings of inadequacy, and they're very common. How has the pandemic impacted it? I think the pandemic, man, has played with our minds. We're working every day with organizations that are dealing with lack of employee engagement, with apathy, with fear. If you think about the change cycle, if we think about how we have gone through that change cycle every 2 weeks, again and again and again and again for the last 18 months, we have change fatigue. And change fatigue will bring out feelings of inadequacy and anxiety and depression. And because of the fatigue, we are more susceptible to habits of thought that are negative. We really have to work hard against it. And remember, people don't change, they don't fear change, they fear loss. And we've lost and lost and lost, whether it's been freedoms or, the ability to see family members, whatever it might be. And that has an impact on how we feel and how we see ourselves.
Yeah, I think we've all experienced that in the last 18 months. There's a question that was submitted by one of our registrants, and it was a personal. I'm hearing impaired, and I've told people at work several times, but as per human nature, people forget and then assume that I'm not responding in an expected way because I lack intelligence. resulting in other people wondering how I got the job that I currently have. How can I overcome other people thinking that I'm an imposter?
Well, first of all, I will have to say that somebody once said to me, it's not your business what other people think of you. And it's, while it is difficult, your ability to demonstrate competence and to be that authentic leader, to demonstrate your values, to talk about your mission and your passion and your purpose, to ask great questions and be curious, all of that will be far greater than somebody's misconception, misperception of you as an individual. It's all about how you show up. And, I wouldn't spend a lot of time with the naysayers. I would spend more time with the people who lift you up.
Good advice. Does imposter syndrome go away with age or experience?
I guess not.
I think by your statement this morning, earlier today when we talked, and maybe not, but yeah, it doesn't. I mean, does it get? I think it's a good thing in some cases, sometimes, but how can a woman in particular combat that imposter syndrome when she's going out looking for work, for instance? I think about young grads, maybe even.
Yeah, that's a really good question. One of the things that we often advise when people come to talk to us about their own job search or their own resume, I always say reposition your resume as really a series of accomplishments. So, if you're a young person coming into the workplace and you maybe have been a camp counselor or a babysitter, a camp counselor has coordinated and organized. They've developed programs. They've monitored safety. So thinking about your job just in the context of a job isn't really going to be helpful for you as you think about your own career or as you're interviewing, but rather think about it as, what did I learn? What did I accomplish? What were the results? And how can I apply that to whatever job I'm applying for? Same with women or men who have been out of the workplace for a while because they have perhaps chosen to stay home with children. There are things that we do that have great impact that we don't put in the context of a job, but are really critical to those job skills. So instead of thinking about what the tactical job has been, think about the competencies that you've developed.
Yeah, it's interesting because when we're talking to students, we really try to enforce that, right? We realize that you may not have the experience or those positions, but you have to think really outside the box. You have to think about what you've done in particular jobs, whether it's a cashier at McDonald's or whatever the case might be. You have to really think about how that translates into, skills needed for a job.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's all about how you communicated and your mindset. Again, how you show up.
There's a few questions that are online. This is an interesting one. Tanya, could you give one of the special examples of you or someone else which you've witnessed that you remember of a person with extreme level of imposter syndrome and the change after working on themselves? Anybody that other than yourself, perhaps? Anybody that you know that?
Yeah. It's really, I'll give you an example. This was an individual who was working in one of our leadership programs and had stayed up all night. We covered a section called passion and purpose in one of our leadership programs, and she arrived the next day to meet with the rest of the team, and she said, "I've just realized something." She said, "I'm in the wrong role. I'm going to completely think about how I change my career, but I'm going to do it in a safe way because I'm really passionate about this, but I'm not passionate about what I'm already doing." So the ability to really reflect on passion and purpose gives you what we call responsibility. I'm going to break that down. Responsibility. So it's, you kind of keep it as one word, it's responsibility, but we have the ability, we have the freedom to respond. And so she responded. She was suffering from terrible imposter syndrome, didn't feel good about this role, didn't feel good about the job she was doing, but it wasn't because she was not capable. It was because it didn't match her passion and purpose. And sometimes we get those things confused.
Most definitely. Question here. I think lack of positive feedback is often part of the old school culture of an employer or employee relationship, maybe contributing to imposter syndrome. Thoughts on this? The idea of changing the system resonates for me there.
Yeah. Well, you know, there are a lot of people who would feel that I have gone through the school of hard knocks, so you need to go through the school of hard knocks. But what we know of that is that individuals respond through, really the best way to respond is through what we call attitude motivation. So not fear and not reward, but rather helping people foster a good, strong internal motivation that permeates their whole career. So old school, yes, you are going to have naysayers. Number one, I would just always say, choose your leader, not your company. You know, really think about who's going to be leading you. It's a relationship that is very important. And get good positive mentors. Make sure that we actually reflect in our personalities the 5 people that we spend the most time with. So think about that. We are a combination of the 5 people that we spend the most time with. So who are you spending time with? How are they contributing to that positive mental attitude? And how are they lifting you up as an individual professional? It's really important. We spend a lot of time at work.
We certainly do. Question online from Michelle. How do you talk positively about your accomplishments, for example, in a job interview without feeling that you are bragging?
Well, in a job interview, you should be
bragging.
Semi-bragging, right. In fact, if you are not, if you're being a little cagey around that, I'm going to think you're not, that you're holding something back and
right.
that you're not confident enough to talk about your own accomplishments. So let's talk about it, talk about some real life examples. You could say something like, when we worked together as a team, I felt this was the result. Here's how we made the organization better. Here's the process improvement that we put in place in order to accomplish it. So that none of that is bragging. That's all just really factual, good information. Now, if you're always saying I, that's not necessarily a good idea either. So talking about it as a team, talking about your superpower, making sure that people understand your level of commitment is important. But again, I go back to, I always hire for attitude and then train for competency.
A couple of comments from people about that subject. It's not bragging, it's based on facts. Even better than bragging is providing actual examples, as you indicated. So,
yeah.
Another question, why is my role important, worthy of much value? I just do X, Y, Z. I feel small about my role and find it hard to see it as valuable to the whole world. Can you comment?
I sure can. I remember when I was in my early 30s, I was asked to take on this other role, and it was so boring and uninteresting to me. And that was the first time I wrote out my mission statement, and it was very clear. My mission is to solve difficult problems, to lead change, and help others develop. That's it. So if you think about a job as a job, maybe it won't be overly interesting. But if you take on a job and you say, oh, you know what, I can solve some really interesting problems in this position, or I can help lead change in this area, or I can really develop the team that I'll be working with in this way, then it changes our whole perspective. So if you think about career progression, it's not about job, job, job. It's about mission accomplished, mission accomplished, mission accomplished. And that's how you reposition and think about the learnings. You know what? We've all done administrative roles that maybe were not our dream job, but I can tell you I've learned something from every single job that I've ever had.
Most
Sometimes
definitely.
there's negative lessons that I don't want to repeat, and sometimes they're very affirming and positive lessons, for sure.
How do you move from a peer relationship to a mentor or supervisory position after furthering education or experience? I tend to think that I have nothing to offer my former peers.
So sorry, can you just repeat that question again?
How do you move from a peer relationship to a mentor or supervisory position after you're furthering your education or experience? I tend to think that I have nothing to offer my former peers.
That is one of the most difficult, I would say, turning points in your career when you are promoted above your peers. And, that I'd say has potential for huge imposter syndrome issues. What you have to do really when you think about that is go back to say, what are your experiences? What are your educational qualifications? But more importantly, what kind of attitude and mindset do you bring to the job? What's your passion? How are you going to be an authentic leader? How are you planning on showing up? How are you demonstrating and promoting other people? How are you demonstrating that? The whole idea around others, developing others. So motivational leadership is about vision, creating a compelling vision. It's about great communication skills. It's about inspiring and motivating. It's about, that innovation and leading change. And if you can do that, then it's really important, to consider that, you're probably the right choice for that either that mentorship or that supervisory role.
You talk about the advisory committee, which I think is really great advice, and choosing mentors and sort of choosing people around you to be those individuals to uplift you. How do you, as a young individual or someone just starting their career or even a mid part of their career, how do you create that advisory committee? Can you give some steps as to who they could reach out to or who are the kind of people that they should be connecting with?
Yeah, well, I always think about it, if you think about the areas of life where you are wanting some mentorship or coaching, they often change over time. If you think about your whole life, there might be mental and educational, there might be career and financial, it might be around health and well-being or social or maybe spiritual. So there are all kinds of different mentors that you can include, and they might change over time, given our progression. Number one, just ask. Do not be afraid to ask somebody to be your mentor. Oftentimes it feels like it's a 1,000-pound phone to pick up the phone and call somebody and ask them about something. We love to hear from young people, and that's the most important. If somebody inspires you, or if you want their advice and you like to buy them a coffee, in a socially distanced manner, go for it. Don't be afraid. So you can you can think about, what do I need to learn right now, and who can I find to help with that? Or you can just think about people who inspire you in the community and ask them.
Yeah, I can certainly give, I think that to what you say is people really like to be asked, and people are very willing to help the younger generation. I certainly know a lot of our alumni have been giving back to our, graduates, young grads, young alumni in many, many different ways, current students. And they really like to give back and share their experience. So don't ever be afraid if you're a young individual just graduating or just in starting their career. Don't ever be afraid to connect with somebody, because they really do feel that it's, they love to help, and they've got a lot of experience to share. So it's great.
Anytime.
We're closing up on our 1 o'clock time, and I know people obviously are maybe tuning into their lunch hour, et cetera. So we wanted to wrap things up. It's been an incredible hour. I've learned so much. I thank Tanya for joining us. It's been wonderful. Thank you for sharing your wisdom, your imposter syndrome wisdom with all of us. It's been really, really interesting. So thank you to all. We look forward to future webinars with all of you. We have something scheduled next month. We're trying to do monthly webinars, professional development webinars. And we have something next month with alumnus Jim Kakaki, who's doing some Public Speaking Essentials. So please feel free to join us. We'd love to have you next month. It's again on the 27th at 12 noon. Just a shout out about our Proudly UNB Awards. These are really significant awards for us, and the nominations are open now, and the deadline to nominate someone is November 7th. There's several awards that we give out, and so please go to that website and check it out. And if you know somebody who's outstanding in your community that you want to nominate, please feel free to do so. You can also receive a follow-up survey from today's webinar. Please share your feedback. If you have suggestions of webinar topics that you'd like us to think about, please share those with us. You'll also receive a link to the recording. We'll post the recording on our website. So you can share with your friends. You can watch this again because there's so much information in here. So I think it's certainly worthy of another viewing. So or share with some friends and family. Special thanks to our affinity partners. We have Manulife Financial, which is our healthcare and dental and life insurance carrier. TD Milosh Monix, which offers car, home, and tenant insurance, and our credit card MBNA. These partners are, again, useful for alumni. They offer great products to our alumni, but they also, the revenue generated from those partnerships help us to support current students and providing sponsorship opportunities for them. So please support those if you're looking for those kind of services. Check those out. Again, thank you to Tanya again, incredible hour. Thank you so much. Thank you to those who tuned in. Again, this is wonderful to connect with you. I wish I could see all of your faces, but maybe someday. But thank you for tuning in. Hope you join us next month with Jim and learning more about public speaking essentials. Until then, have a great day and a great week, and take care of yourselves. Thank you so much.